Hi, I'm Jenny Rushmore of Cashmerette, and today I'm going to take you through how to sew a wrap skirt. We are going to be sewing the Randolph skirt, which is one of the patterns included in my book, Sewing the Curve, Learn How to Sew Clothes to Boost Your Wardrobe and Your Confidence. Now, I love the Randolph skirt. It's a simple design, but it's a little bit elevated. I've got one of the skirts from the book actually here. So it has this chunky tie, which looks very cool in this plaid here. And it has a slightly asymmetric hem, which basically means that the two levels of the hem don't totally meet up flat. They're at a slight angle, which kind of is a cool look. There are two lengths, so there are two views of the Randolph, and basically there's a knee length and then there's a midi length. I'm a big fan of a midi, but if you're not, don't worry, you can make the knee length one. So it's fully functional. So what that means is you open it up. So here are the ties. I'm going to show you how to do that. And then when you open it all the way up, you can see that there's a button here. So that holds it in your body underneath the front. So we're going to be talking about how to do buttons and buttonholes. If you undo that, then it opens up all the way. So basically it's like one long piece of fabric that wraps around your body. You fasten it with the button here, then you bring the front over and you tie it up. And you can see in this photo what it looks like when you are wearing it. So in this sew along, I'm going to show you how to sew with woven fabrics, how to sew waist darts, how to sew facings, sewing a buttonhole and sewing a button, stitching in the ditch, which is a cool little technique for hidden stitching, which helps secure down facings inside your garment, and also a certain way of hemming woven fabrics involving facings. So before you start sewing your Randolph, the first thing you need to do is find your size. So you need to measure your waist and your hips. If you have Sewing the Curve, go to the measuring section and there's lots of advice on how to measure yourself. If you don't, go to cashmerette.com/sizing. Now, at that website, cashmerette.com/sizing, we also have our size calculator. So what you can do is plug in your measurements, so what your waist measurement is and what your hip measurement is, and it will show you what size you should make. Now, if you are between two sizes, then you're going to do what's called grading between sizes. So for instance, if you are a 24 waist and a 32 hip, you are going to actually adapt the pattern to be a 24 at the waist and a 32 at the hip. You can find out more about how to do that because it's a little bit trickier than average at cashmerette.com/grading Randolph. So once you've decided what size to make, then it's on to picking your fabric. So the Randolph can actually work in a whole range of woven fabric. Woven meaning it doesn't stretch. The two samples in the book are made out of very different kind of fabric. So this incredibly fun multicolored one is a rayon twill. So it's lightweight, it's great for the summer, it's very, very flowy. And then this one is made out of a wool suiting, which is much warmer, as you can imagine, and much more stable. On the whole, rayon and twills are a little bit harder to sew, not impossible, but if it's your very first project, I would potentially go for something a bit more stable, like a cotton or a wool. So those are the two out of the book, but I wanted to show you a few other options. So this is a lovely linen. So linen is a really great first option for making something like a Randolph because it's stable, and what that means is it's kind of easy to sew. So things like rayon twill can sometimes shift a little bit as you're trying to sew them, whereas a linen will stay nice and firmly in place. So this is a gorgeous kind of raspberry linen we have here, so that would be a good option. You can also pick things like this, which is basically they call it suiting. So it's fabric that you make suits out of. I believe that this one is like a wool poly blend, but again, you want something that has a little bit of drape. So you don't want something that's totally stiff because it won't sit nicely. You want something that has a little bit of give, a little bit of drape. I talk about this more in Sewing the Curve and give you some examples. And this is a nice example of that. It's a slightly thicker fabric, but it still has good drape. And then here I wanted to share with you, this is actually another kind of, I think it's a poly crepe I think. It's actually an ex-designer one, and it's another nice one. So like it's flowy, you can see, but it's sort of a medium weight, and it's actually a really nice option. So you need to get your fabric. So once you've got your fabric, you need interfacing. So interfacing is a special kind of fabric as well, really, that you bond to your main fabric to make it a little bit stiffer. So I recommend weft interfacing, which basically is a woven interfacing. There are two types. One type of interfacing is woven. The other is made like paper, like in the same method as paper. And I always recommend the woven one because it behaves the most like fabric. And when the interfacing is bonded to your fabric, you want it still to behave like fabric. So when we get to that step in the sew along, I'll show you more about how it works. But you need to buy that interfacing. Then what else do you need? Well, you need needle and thread for your sewing machine. You need a hand needle. And you need a button. Now the button is going to be on the inside. I just showed you a little bit about where it goes. Roughly we recommend about 1 inch in diameter. If it's a little bit off, it actually doesn't matter. It's on the inside. And you just want something smooth because it's going to sit against your body. So you don't want anything that's going to irritate you. Then you want something to turn out the corners when you sew them. So a point turner, which is what this is, like made for, is really, really helpful. These are actually often used in paper crafts as well as scorers, but basically it has this kind of blunt, but sharp but blunt, I was about to say. It's like a sharp end, but it's not totally pointy on the end. It's like blunt. If you don't have one of these, a knitting needle can work, and a push, a pencil, but these point turners are a great thing to have. And then you need something to open up the buttonhole after you sew it. So my two recommendations are either a scalpel, also known sometimes as an X-Acto knife. So any kind of scalpel or really like a box cutter will do. Or you can actually use a buttonhole chisel. So this is like a specific sewing thing that's made for buttonholes. And basically it's a blade that's the width of a typical buttonhole. You do have to use like a rotary cutting mat. So you need like a slightly plastic mat underneath. You don't want to do it directly onto a hard surface. It will hurt it. And basically you place it on the buttonhole and push it through and you rock it a bit to open the buttonhole. But again, when we get to that point in the sew along, I will take you through more on how you use it. So the next step is to get your pattern pieces ready. So there are a couple of different options for getting the pattern pieces for the Randolph. The first option is to use the printed patterns that are available in the back of the paper edition of the book. You have to look through to find out where the pieces are, and they're overlapped. So follow the key, it'll explain to you what pages they're on, what color they're in, and then basically use tracing paper to trace them off. And if the piece is separated into two, you then tape them together to make them into one piece. Alternatively, you can use the PDF patterns. So go to the back cover of the book or in the Kindle at the very end, and it will give you the code and the information for how to download the pattern pieces. When you do that, you have two options. Either you can download them and print them at home and then tape the pieces together, or you can send the A0 files off to a copy shop to have them printed. In the US, places like pdfplotting.com. So there's lots more information on how to trace off and get your pattern pieces ready in the book. So if you haven't already done that, head over there. So here are the pattern pieces for the Randolph, and they're pretty big, so it's a little hard to show you them all at the same time. So I'm going to move them around so you can get the sense. So this is the front overlayer. So when you put the dress on, the one on the top and the tie comes off and you tie it up. So this is the front overlayer here. And what you can see in all of these pieces is there are two length options. So this is the knee length option, and this is the midi length option. There are notches that you need to cut into your fabric when you're cutting them out. And you need to note, are you cutting for view A, which is the midi length, or are you cutting for view B, which is the knee length? And these notches are really important later on. So you need to make sure you have them in there. The other thing that we have here is we have this mark here, and this is for where the button is going to be going on the other side. However, I'm going to show you in a little bit that you can actually put the button wherever works for you to fit your body. So you can chalk that onto your piece for now on the wrong side, but don't worry about it too much because we may move it. Now, one thing that's a bit of a quirk about making an asymmetrical pattern is, unlike with symmetrical patterns, where it doesn't really matter like what way up the fabric is when you cut it, because it's going to be symmetrical anyway. With asymmetrical garments, if you want to be able to follow along the instructions, which especially as a beginner you definitely do, you need to cut them correctly. So in this case, what that means is when you lay your fabric out, it should be wrong side up. So if there's a print, you shouldn't be seeing it. It should be the other side. You're looking at the back of the fabric. So wrong side up on the fabric, and then you place your pattern piece right side up. And then you cut around them. And if you do that, you will end up with your pieces facing in the right direction, and you'll be able to follow the instructions well. So this is the front overlayer. Then we have the front underlayer. So this is a kind of interestingly angled piece. There's various reasons I won't go into for like why it's angled like this, but basically it allows it not to peek through. So with this, you are just cutting one. Again, it's unusual when you're cutting symmetrical things, you're normally cutting two, but you're only cutting one. Now, do you see this triangle? So when you hem something, if it's at an angle, you need to have this little kick out, and I'll show you why. Because when you hem it and you turn it up, can you see by having that kick out, you actually end up with a straight line. Clever. So this is the kind of little thing that like makes a sewing pattern like a little bit better. So you end up with this kick up. But because we have a shorter length here, we have to allow for it. Now, if you're doing the longer one, it's actually really simple. Just either cut that off or fold it up and just cut like this. If you think you are going to be using the pattern piece again and you might make the shorter one, then what I recommend is you do exactly what I have here. You keep this piece on and then you just fold it in. And you're going to find that on multiple pieces. So if you're making the long one, just fold in the triangles that you're seeing above at the shorter level. So here is the back skirt piece. Now this piece is cut on the fold. So this is the fold here. You can see the arrows. So you fold the fabric, or you can place the pattern piece like this and then flip it over and cut the other side, which I show you how to do in the book. There are darts on the back, so you want to mark those, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. Next up, we have the tie piece. So when you go to tie the skirt, one side, the tie is like actually built onto the front overlayer, so it's just like an extension. But on the other side, it's a separate tie that we put into the side seam. So this is the tie, pretty straightforward. And then next, the whole edge of the skirt is finished with what's called a facing. So a facing is a piece of fabric that kind of is the same shape as the outside of the fabric around the edge. And what it allows you to do is have a clean edge. So you don't have any top stitching, there's nothing visible, you just have this nice crisp edge, and it's a really common technique, so it's a great thing to learn. So we have multiple pieces for our facing. They look a little confusing to start with, but it will make sense eventually. So first of all, we have the fabric overlayer facing. So I'm just gonna have to move this around a little bit so that you can see it. And what I'm gonna show you, hold on a second, is that if you look at these two together, you will see how they go together. And I think this helps. So if you look, this basically means you're going to have a double layer on this tie, and then it's going along the edge at the top, but then it scoops out, so it's not totally lined, and then it goes all the way down the front as well. So this is the facing piece. And again, it's really important to make sure that you are following the cutting instructions, because this piece needs to be cut as a reflection of the other one, because the right side of the fabric here will actually show on the inside of the garment. So it will look kind of pretty on the inside of the garment. So this is going to be right side up. So you just continue to cut in the same way as the front, but you want to just double check you've done it right. There is a good point in the construction when you kind of can do a little double check. So I will point that out to you. And then we just have the two other pieces of the facing. So we have the back facing, and this is cut on the fold, and this is going to be attached to the back. And then we have the front underlayer facing. So the previous big T one you saw was the overlayer. This is the underlayer. You only have one of these pieces. Now this piece can be a bit confusing when you cut it out of fabric because can be a bit hard to tell what end is what. And this is where the notches are really important. So there's a notch just at the end that is attached to something else. And that's the most common way that you'll see a notch. A notch indicates it needs to match another notch. And in this case, it actually matches this notch eventually when we sew them together. So it's important to have that notch there because what you don't want to do is try and sew this end, which you can see would be really tempting because it's not so far off, but it's enough off that it would actually be totally wrong. Whereas this end perfectly matches. So make sure you put your notches in. So those are the pattern pieces. It's definitely from a pattern piece point of view, a little bit more complex than like making a t-shirt or making a symmetrical dress. But once you've got your head around it and once you have pattern pieces cut out and the fabric pieces cut out, it's actually a really straightforward sew. So just make sure that you go slowly at the beginning and we will get there. So with that, we are now going to go on to sewing. So the first thing you want to do is just check you cut out your pattern pieces correctly before you start. So your front overlayer should look like this. So when the right side is facing up, so this is the wrong side, it should look like this. Then you have your middle back piece looking like this, and just keeping on moving them over. And then your front underlayer looking like this. So the curve on the left and the diagonal edge on the right. So assuming that you did that all correct, congratulations, we are going to start by marking the darts on the wrong side of the back piece. So I'm going to turn it over. And here you need your pattern piece. Now, usually I would actually mark these as I cut them, but this is kind of an easier way to show you guys how to do it. So you want a ruler, you want some kind of marking implement. I usually recommend a chalk liner, but in this case, I'm just using a pen. I'm gonna use this pen so that you can see what I'm doing, but you would not use a blue pen because it wouldn't come out. Okay, and then I use a pin. So this is my way of doing it. There are lots of different ways, but this is the way that I think is the easiest and most accurate. So I've got the fabric here, and I'm going to place the pattern piece on the top and align it. So aligned like that. So the edges are aligned. Now I'm going to mark, and it's on the wrong side of my pattern piece, the ends of both of these legs of the dart. You're going to be doing this in chalk or a erasable marker, not in Sharpie. Now I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to put it through the end of the dart. So you want to make sure you're in the right end. So I'm making a size 12, it's the size 12. And then holding it in place here, I'm just going to peel the paper. Oh, see, I messed it up then. Let's do it again. So you want the pin to go through the paper and through the fabric. It hadn't gone through the fabric there. So keeping that in, fold this back until you can see the pin just there sticking through. And then I'm going to mark where the end of that pin is. I'm just doing it a little bit more bold so that you can see it. You can just make a little mark. And then it is as simple as joining the dots. So I'm simply going to take a ruler and join these up. So I find this the easiest way to mark darts and get a really straight line because I'm not attempting to trace the straight line through the paper. I am just doing it freehand. So for the other side, simply going to flip the pattern piece over and do the other side. Now, obviously on this side, the pattern markings on the paper are now facing down. So you have to kind of peel it up a little bit to see where the ends of the dart legs are. And as it happens, because we did the other side first, there's actually a hole in the pattern piece here at the bottom of the dart. So I just stick the pin back through there. Peel this over carefully, not pulling the pin out. Mark where the pin's going through the fabric. And draw those up again. There we go. So Now I have my 2 darts marked on the wrong side of my fabric. Next thing we're going to do is sew them. So I'm going to start by sewing this one. So the easiest way to do these is basically you're going to fold the fabric back through the middle of the dart. So see the end of the dart is here, that's going to be the end, and at the top you're going to match the dart legs up. I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to just pin at the top there. Then I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of the dart. I'm just going to flatten that a bit with my finger, and I'm going to put a pin in at the bottom just to mark the end of it there. Now I'm going to put a few pins in on the line, and as I do that, I'm going to look on the other side and see, is it on the line on the other side? And look, I don't know if it's very clear, but it's not. It's a little bit off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just realign the fabric with my fingers a tiny bit and try again. And now it's meeting up. So that's what you want to do, and do that a couple of times to make sure that the dart legs are being pinned correctly either side. So again, that one's off, okay? So I need to scooch the layers a little bit, and now it's on again. So sometimes you do it and it works first time, sometimes you need to play around a little bit. So there we go. So that is all pinned down there. Now actually, just to show you like the reality of when you're sewing, most times you would then just pin the other dart as well, because you want to do as much pinning as you can and then go to the sewing machine and do as much sewing as you can. So I'm going to do that as well. So I can open it up here, you can see, and I'm going to do the same in the other direction on this side. So I'm going to bring the dart legs together at the top. Then I'm going to fold down to the end point there. And then I'm going to do the same. I'm going to try and line them up roughly, pin through the line, check. Ah, good first time that time. Pin through, a little bit off. Now, one thing you might have noticed is I was rotating the fabric a little bit there. The reason is when you pin a dart, it's a little bit more advanced. When you pin a dart, ideally you want it to look like this with the pin heads here, so that when you sew it through the machine, they're going in the right direction to pull them out. If you pin it this way, theoretically, in fact, actually you shouldn't pin it this way basically, because you want the inside bit of the dart that's eventually going to be folded out to be on the right hand side as you go through the machine. So the needle's here like you always want your dart to be going through like that. You do not want your dart to be going through like that, because on a sewing machine you want the smaller bit of the fabric to the right of the needle. So when you're pinning, you need to remember that, and you want to ideally always have it looking like this as you're pinning. And it also lets you put your pins like this so that as you're sewing through, you pull them out. You don't want to be sewing through and pulling out like this. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So I have the 2 darts pinned. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew them up. So I've set my sewing machine to a 2.5 length straight stitch, and we're going to sew the dart. So we start at the outer edge, a few steps in, and then back stitch to secure. There we go. And then just sew down the dart, taking out the pins as we go. And then as you get towards the end of the dart, there are a couple of different ways you can finish it. What you don't want to do is back stitch. In sewing the curve, I take you through different options, but I'm now going to show you the one I recommend for beginners. So that is, we're going to sew straight off the edge and go for 1 inch or 2. Okay, I'm going to lift up the presser foot and I'm going to snip the threads a couple of inches from the end. It doesn't matter exactly where. Then, you want to separate out these 2 threads. So sometimes it's good to get a pin to do that. we go. Sometimes the threads are more cooperative than other times. There we go. Okay, so I've got my 2 separate threads there, and I'm literally going to knot them by hand a couple of times. So once, twice, and by doing this, it helps you get a really smooth end to the dart. And then you simply snip it off. So that is sewing the back dart. Now I'm just going to sew the second. Okay, so those 2 darts are sewn. So now we're going to press them towards the center back. And to do that, we're going to press them over a tailor's ham, which lets us press over a curved surface because these are curved. If you don't have a tailor's ham, you can roll up a towel and bend it around to create a similar curved surface. So I'm simply going to place the fabric over, push the dart in the right direction with my finger, and then press. So remember, pressing, you want to go up and down. So I'm going to do that on the wrong side. And then you want to go over and press it from the right side. Now, if you are using a fabric that can shine easily, you want to use a press cloth to do this, to not damage your fabric. But I'm just using a cotton that's going to be fine. So there, I have now pressed one of the darts in. I'm just going to press the other one. Okay, so there are, let me take this bit off, there are the two darts in the back piece pressed this way. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pin the fabric overlay to the back. So I've just rotated my back piece around so that you can try and see it. This is the top, here's the dart, this is the side seam. And you can see this curve of the side seam. So now I'm going to get my front overlayer piece, this one, and I'm going to place it right sides together along this side seam. So it's along the left side seam. And actually should be fairly obvious because these are going to match. So I'm simply going to pin it at the top. Then I'm going to shuffle down to the bottom and pin it together here. And then you can match notches and just pin the remaining side, making sure the pieces are nicely aligned at the edge. When you're a beginner, it can be nice to do a bit more pinning because it helps keep things stable. As you get a little bit more advanced, you'll find you don't need quite so many pins. And now I'm going to very simply just sew along that seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just over to the machine and going to sew this seam. So I am aligning the edge of the fabric with the 1/2 inch marking on my machine. If you don't have one on your machine, you can use a little piece of tape to mark the edge there. And I'm going to start by backstitching. And then simply sew the length of the seam. So as you go along, make sure the edges of the fabric are aligned. Take out the pins as you go. There we go, that's the seam sewn. Now I'm going to finish the seam allowance. So there are different options that are laid out in sewing the curve for how to do that. I'm going to use a serger, but you can also use pinking shears, or you can do a zigzag very close to the edge. I'm going to finish it and then I'm going to press the seam towards the back. So here's the seam I just sewed, and then you can see that I have finished it with a serger, but you can do whatever you like. So now we're going to press that seam towards the back. So I'm going to open it up. And a good rule of thumb is any time that a seam has a curve in it, which you can see this one does, you want to get your ham or your towel. So for this upper section, I'm going to place it over the ham to get the curve, push with my fingers towards the back, and press. There we go. I'm going to going to carry on, and again, you've got to push it around the ham to get the curve. And then lower down, there's actually no curve. So it's only at this upper hip. So I'm then going to take that out. And for the remaining, I am just going to press flat. Then now, as every time you press, I'm going to turn it over, get the PAM out again. Make sure that the seam allowance is still going in the right direction underneath. Sometimes it can flip. And I'm going to press that seam allowance again. Moving along. Don't need the ham anymore. And obviously, you know, I'm doing this on a small demonstration board. If you were doing it on an ironing board, you probably wouldn't need to keep on moving the whole thing so much. Okay, so now we have our back with darts, and then we have our front overlayer with the extension. So the next thing we need to do is get the tie ready. So the tie looks like this, and it's pretty simple. So I'm just going to fold it in half lengthways, matching up the sides, and I'm going to pin down the long side and then along here. I'm going to leave this end piece open. So I'm going to do either end first, then pin across the diagonal. There we go. And now I'm going to pin this. Okay, now I'm going to sew starting here, going all the way down, turning at this point, and going down here. Now, one trick when you are a beginner, turning here can be a little bit tricky. It can be a little bit confusing, like what point do I turn at? So you can mark the corner on first. So the way you do that is get a ruler. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So what I'm just going to do is basically mark the seam allowances in at the corner. So I'm going to start by marking the top one in. Hold on, I'm going to use a different pen. Okay, I'm going to mark this top one in, like that. And then I'm going to mark the diagonal edge in. So you would do this in a chalk marker. And then I actually have some guidance for myself. So I'm like, okay, I know that when I hit this point here, that's when I'm going to turn. Otherwise, it can be a little easy to like not end too early or end too late. So over to the sewing machine. So I've got the tie. I'm going to start by back stitching. And then going down the first side. So I'm approaching where I drew my marks on. Now I'm going down the line now. As I start to get towards the end, I'm going to go slower. And if you really want to slow down, you can actually use the hand wheel and manually turn it until you hit that point. So now I'm at the point. You want to keep the needle down, lift the presser foot, and then pivot the fabric around until the blue line is directly facing towards you. And then just put the presser foot back down. And now, continue sewing. We're going to do our back stitching at the back end. So there you go. So here is the tie sewn. So the next thing I'm going to do, first I'm just going to trim this corner off a little bit, because when you turn corners, you don't want to have too much bulk in the actual corner of the seam allowance. So I just cut across, didn't go through the stitching line, but that will give us a little bit more room to turn it. In addition, I'm actually going to cut this end off, which can also do the similar thing. So I'm just trimming at the corners of the seam allowances. Now, if you're using a very thick fabric like a wool, you can also trim these seam allowances in half, which can also help. Here I don't really need to, but let me just show you what I mean. So I'm literally just going to cut down the middle of the seam allowance. So if you're using something bulkier like wool, that's a good idea. Now I'm just going to turn it right sides out. So Literally just push it through with your fingers. Different people have different ways of doing it, but this is fine. So pull it roughly out. But what you'll find is like the ends don't go out. So that is where your point turner comes in handy. So you put it inside and gently, because you don't want to poke a hole through the end, which is very easy to do. You just gently use the point turner to push out the corner of the fabric. So you have that corner and then you also have this little angle here. So I just push those out, take this out. And then I'm going to first just press this with my hands a little bit. So the edge seam here, you want to be on the very edge of the tie where you sewed the seam. There we go. So have it looking nice. And now I'm going to press. You can use a little bit of steam. I'm avoiding it on the hole so that I don't make the lens steamy. Okay, so now you have a tie. I'm just going to trim these bits that are falling off. So this piece is open, but that's okay because it's going to be closed in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to baste the tie to the front underlayer. So what we're going to do is take it. Now you're going to take the edge with the seam, it's going to be at the top. So the point is going to look like this. And you find the notch on the side seam of this piece here. And the bottom of the tie matches that notch there. So when you line them up, it's going to look like this. So there's going to be about 1 inch here at the top. This piece is going to be at an angle, that is correct. The pointy bit is going to be at the bottom here. And basically what we're going to do is we're simply going to baste at the side seam here. And in this case, all basting means is use a long stitch. So I'm going to use a 5 length stitch. And we're doing it within the seam allowance, which means instead of sewing at 1/2 inch, I'm going to sew at about 1/4 inch. The reason I'm doing this is to secure these two pieces together so that when we then attach it to the rest of the skirt, the tie is in the right place. Technically speaking, you could skip this and simply make a sandwich and sew through all of them at the same time. But especially as a beginner, the more control you can have, the better. So by basting it first, you make sure that it will definitely be in the right place. So I've adjusted to a long stitch length, and basically as long as it's less than 1/2 inch from the edge, it's fine. We just want it to be in the seam allowance so it doesn't show eventually. So I'm just going to use the edge of my presser foot here to guide me, which is roughly 1/4 inch. Here, you don't need to worry about back stitching because it doesn't matter, it's going to be sewn over again. So that is it. It is now basted at the side seam. Okay, now we're going to attach the underlayer to the back. So here's what you already sewed. This is the front overlayer and the back. So I'm just going to open this up. So this is the other side of the back, and you can see, matches quite nicely there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip this over with the tie attached and line up these edges. So I'm going to reorient this so that you can see it. Okay, now you need to be a little bit careful here with the tie. So you want to make sure that the tie isn't bunched up and isn't sort of folding into the seam as you're pinning it. So I'm just making sure it's flat there. I'm going to start by pinning at the top. Then I'm going to pin this tie area carefully, making sure that none of the tie is like buckling up or folding up in there. Then I'm going to go to the other end and pin the end. And then I am simply going to pin everything in the middle. Just smoothing this out. Then, just the same as the other side, I'm going to sew along. I'm going to finish the seam allowance, and then I'm going to press towards the back. So now this side seam is sewn, and you can see that the tie is enclosed in this seam nicely. So it should be free floating, but with this inch at the top. The next thing that I went ahead and did is finish the edges of 2 edges. So this diagonal edge, so I have finished that with serging all the way down to the bottom, and then finish this bottom edge as well. So this is something usually in sewing, you sew a seam and then you finish the edges. But occasionally, for a variety of reasons, you might finish the edge first. So that is what we have done here. So our outer shell is now pretty much ready. So what we're going to move on to is the facings. So the first thing you want to do is just check that your facings were cut in the correct way, because if they weren't, then they're not going to work. And again, this is to do with it being asymmetrical. So you want to lay out your pieces. So here is the outer layer facing piece, number 5. Then you want your back middle piece, hold on, not that one. You want your back middle piece here, which is the symmetrical one. It should be going here. And then number 7, which is the front underlayer facing, going here. So it should look like this. If it looks like a mirror image, you've cut it wrong and you need to recut it now because it won't go together, but it needs to look like this. The second thing that needs to happen is they need to be interfaced. So I already interfaced these 2 pieces here, but let me show you how to do the other one. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to apply interfacing. Now, this is the way I recommend doing it generally. So I actually place my interfacing face up, which means that the dots of glue are facing up. Then I place my fabric piece on top like this. Then I put a press cloth on the top. Now, if you do it in this order, if any extra glue comes off, it comes onto the press cloth rather than on your ironing board. But you can technically do it the other way too. What you do just want to make sure is that the glue is facing the wrong side of the fabric. So, put my press cloth over there, and then I'm simply going to press. Depending on the kind of interfacing you use, there are different guidance. There's different guidance for like how long you should press it for. The key thing is you want to hit all the different pieces of the pattern piece, and you don't want to slide the iron because that will distort things. It's often helpful to use a little bit of steam. Okay, so now I'm going to peel it off, and as you can see, there's a tiny bit of interfacing there, and it's actually stuck to the press cloth rather than my iron, so that's the reason we use the cloth. So there I have my piece, and now it has this additional strength to it on the back, and what this does is helps give structure to the side and edges of the skirt so that they will sit really nicely. So the next thing we're going to do is start assembling the facing. So I've finished applying the interfacing, and now we're going to start assembling. So first you want to lay your front overlayer facing, which is number 5, flat out on your work surface, face up. And then you want to get your center back facing, which is piece number 6. And it's really easy to mix up 6 and 7. So you want to make sure you have number 6, which is the symmetrical. And then ideally you want to finish the ends of the facing too. So finish the ends here, finish the ends here, and finish the ends on your piece number 7 as well. This is actually going to make it ever so slightly easier for you even than what's in the instructions. So we're now going to place one end of number 6, keeping the curve at the bottom, so you don't want it that way, right? Well, you also see it doesn't really align, but you'll align the edges up, and there's notch there as well to help you. And you simply pin those together at the end. So now I'm going to sew across the end and then press the seam allowances apart like this. Okay, so this seam was sewn, and then I just press the seam allowances open, as you can see here. So now we're going to sew the other end of the back facing. So lay it out again. We're going to bring piece number 7. Now, this is a ever so slightly asymmetrical piece. So you want to be quite careful that you are doing it the right way around, because it's really easy to do it wrong. So you need to find the end that has the notch, and the end that has the notch is the end that attaches here. But it's very easy to accidentally do it at this end upside down, so be careful about that. So again, I already finished the edge that's going to be connected. You actually don't need to finish this edge yet. And I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm going to pin it, sew it, and then press the seam allowances open. Okay, so now piece number 7 is attached there, and you can see that it's forming a nice continuous curve all along to the top of the tie. So the next thing we're going to do is finish a long edge. So we're going to finish the bottom here. So starting here, going all the way along, all the way along, all the way along, round this curve, and then all the way down to the bottom here. The reason for doing that will become evident when we sew it all together. You don't need to sew the bottoms or the ends or the other outside bit, just this inner area. So again, you can serge that, which is what I'm going to do, but you can also use pinking shears or do a little zigzag. You could even, if you're going really fancy, bind the edge, but that's for another day. Okay, so I have finished, as you can see, the inner edge of this piece. So now the next thing is to attach the facing to the garment itself. So attach it to the shell. So we're going to be doing this right sides together. So I am going to show you sort of bit by bit because the pieces are so big, I can't show you them all on the screen at the same time. So here's the front overlayer. So let's start over here because it's kind of distinctive. Now, I am going to then get my facing and basically face it, ha 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 ha, together. So it's going to match up here. So basically, we're just now going to do a lot of pinning. So I'm going to begin by pinning at the outer corner, matching those up, matching that corner up. And then I'm going to bring the facing along the top, all the way to the side seams where the seams will match up. There we go. And now I'm going to pin in the middle of those. So just going along the top, matching them up. And if all has gone well, they should match exactly. Okay, so now I've pinned this bit. Now I'm going to pin the edge here. So I'm just going to rotate it a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to match up the bottom. Now, here is where it's a little bit different. So you are not doing what you might imagine, which is matching it all the way down to the bottom. You're actually matching the edge here with the notch on the front overlayer piece, which is an inch up from the bottom. So if you haven't marked it, you can also just do it an inch up from the bottom. So I'm going to mark it there, or pin it there. And then again, just sort of smooth everything out, check it's all lining up at the edges, and just continue with this pinning. So much pinning. You want to make sure this curve is nicely aligned. Keep on going. And then all along here. Okay. So the front overlayer and the facing here are all pinned together. So let's move on to the next section, which is the back. So I'll lay the back flat there. I'm going to bring my facing over. And I'm going to do the same thing. So it's pinned at that end already. I'm going to pin it at the other end of the back. And then again, just align the pieces. I generally recommend that you mark the center of anything on the fold, so you can mark the center backs up. And then when you get to the darts, make sure that the dart's still facing the center back. And I always recommend pinning through that so that you are securing the dart in the right direction. You don't want it to twist. So same thing here, make sure the dart's going in the right direction. Okay, back's done. And now let's do the underlayer. So this is the part that has the tie. So you want to make sure that the tie is not getting caught in this seam. So you can just kind of hold it and make sure it hasn't. But another thing you can do, and I'm going to do it now, is just fold it over a few times, fold it out of the way, and then I'm just going to pin it to the skirt here. Now it's out of the way and I don't need to worry about it. So I'm going to continue pulling the facing over here, and it's going to match at the end. So I'm going to bring it along to the end and then do the top. So now the facing is pinned on all the way around, we're actually going to sew the facing on in one long seam. So you're going to start at the bottom, 1/2 inch up here. So a little bit unusual, not necessarily what you might imagine, although you'll see why in a minute. And this is another area where you can mark on your seam allowance first to help you. So I'm going to mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And then I'm going to mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance down the front so that I have a nice corner marking there to help me pivot. I'm going to go up to the top, and up here, another place where it's great to mark your seam allowances in so that you can get a nice corner. So 1/2 inch there, 1/2 inch there. Then at the top, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch. There we go. So we have 2 pivot spots there. And then finally, I'm going to go all the way across to the top and mark it in here as well. There is no shame to giving yourself some guidance. I think even experienced sewists sometimes do it. And by doing it this way, you are likely to get a really nice result. So you are going to start sewing here, go across, up, all the way around, up, turning around, all the way along the top, turn around, down to there. So you can see it in the instructions, but basically it's just one long edge seam. Okay, so I'm going to start at this lower edge, back stitch here, and just go for it. Oops. I'm going to arrive at the corner, needle down, press a foot up, and spin. And keep on adjusting your fabric. Then when it comes to the curve, you just want to make sure you are gently easing the fabric around, giving yourself a nice curve. Now I'm approaching my markings that I made. I'm going to go up to the very corner, use the hand wheel, down, press a foot up, spin it round. Needle down, press a foot up, spin it round. And as you go over the seam allowances, you want to make sure you keep them pressed open and that they're flat. Okay, there we go. So I'm getting right in the corner there, turning around and going down. And then I'm just going to end at the edge of the facing. And there we go. Okay, so I've sewn on the facing all the way around. So there's a few more steps before we fully flip it out. So the first thing we're going to do is trim the corners. So once again, we want to cut across the corners. And basically this helps get sharp corners and reduce bulk. So do not cut through the stitching, but close. And if you want, this is something, again, people tend to do, you can cut even more off the edges across like that, just to get even less fabric in that corner. So that's the upper corner. Let's go all the way over here. So now we can do these. So again, I'm just going to cut across here, trim a little bit more as well. Okay, so trimmed there. Then I'm going to trim at the bottom here. So this is a little bit different. So here we want to trim across, but actually also across the bottom here. But you don't want to go too much over about 1/2 inch. It's going to be enclosed ultimately, so it kind of doesn't matter that much, but that's kind of what you're aiming for. So I'm going to go about 1/2 inch across like that. Now, the final thing we're going to do in terms of trimming is we are going to make some snips into the corner here. And the reason is it basically just helps it to turn and give you a nice curve when you press it. So you just want to go, again, up to, but not through the stitching line. If you go through the stitching line, you're actually going to have to go back and re-stitch it slightly in, otherwise a hole is going to appear in your skirt and you do not want that. Now again, if you use a very thick fabric, I would recommend cutting all of the seam allowance in half, but in this case we don't need to. So the next thing we're going to do is understitching. So if you recall, understitching is something that helps stop things that are meant to be inside your garment flipping outside. And in this case, we need this facing. So we don't want this facing flipping to the outside of the garment when you're wearing it. So we are going to understitch it in two places. So the first thing we're going to do is understitch as much as we can on the upper waistband. So the way we do that is by flipping this over. Now, you want to keep this seam allowance flat here so that effectively we're doing this, okay? You don't want the seam allowance going down when you flip it. You want the seam allowance to stay there, and then the fabric goes on top of the seam allowance. Now, when you do understitching on something like this, you can't go all the way to the ends because you can see you hit this, and at the other end you hit this. So what you're going to do is sew a line just inside on the facing side, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line, as far as you can here, all the way along to as far as you can over here. It doesn't matter exactly how far you get, you know, like if the majority of it is understitched, that will be sufficient. So we're going to do that one. And then also we're going to do the same thing on the front outer edge. So in this case, we flip it this way. And again, you are going to understitch just on the facing side of this seam all the way along. Okay, so I'm going to start by doing the waistband understitching. So here's the piece. We're going to flip it over and I'm going to put it under the sewing machine. So you have a couple of ways of sewing evenly from this seam. My favorite is to put the seam in the middle of the presser foot, and then if you have this option on your machine, move the needle over. So I actually have a dial that will move it over. And by doing this, I don't even look at the needle as I'm sewing, I just look here. If you don't have that and you can't move your needle, then what you can do is find somewhere in your presser foot to align your fabric with. So you could be like, okay, I'm gonna align it with this junction between the plastic and the metal on mine and do that. But if you can do it in the middle like that, even better. So as I go, I'm just gonna keep on making sure that the seam allowance is being caught underneath. Oh, that wasn't very pretty. I'll deal with that later. Okay, so keep on adjusting it. I'm using my fingers underneath to make sure that seam allowance is going in the right way. Backstitch, so that I got to there, which is fine. Okay, so that's the understitching done. From the back, it kind of just looks like that. So now I'm going to understitch the front. So turn it around. So here's my front. Again, I'm going to flip this over as far as we can go. And go. Keeping the seam allowance under. And I'm just going to end there. Okay, so that understitching is done there. Okay, so the understitching is done. So now the exciting thing of flipping the facings to the outside. So we're going to go bit by bit. So I'm going to start with this corner. We've trimmed it already, and I'm going to take the point turner, and I'm going to show you the way I like to do it personally. So I stick my finger in here, place the point turner along the sewn edge there, and then pull it round the point turner. And this is actually nicer than like using the point turner to stab the corner out, because you're less likely to go through the corner and you get a nice little corner. Okay, so I'm just going to continue flipping it. Then we're going to come back. It takes a few times this. So we're getting to the other end here. So this time I'm just going to pull it. We have to pull it through first. And then you can actually do the same thing with the point turner. You don't have to do this, but I'm just kind of showing you something a little bit advanced. So I have my finger and thumb here. I'm going to hold it there. And again, just fold the fabric over rather than pushing the point. You might still have to wiggle it a little bit. So here we go. And then I'm going to put the pointer back in. And do it there. Okay. Now we go down the front edge. Oh, hold on. Nope. Where am I going? Okay, go down the front edge. And then we have a final corner to turn. I'm going to put my finger on and pull it over. Now, some interesting things are occurring as we are turning it over. So what happened at the bottom, can you see what happened here? It actually flipped the hem up. So the hem is enclosed inside this facing here. Do you see? It's really interesting. So let me just put it on the outside again. So remember, we sewed this. So by doing it here, this is a common sewing technique to get a really nice edge. What we have done is we have flipped up the hem and we have enclosed it in this front facing, and it gives you this very, very nice clean edge at the front. So we now have a hem that's sort of naturally flipped up, and something similar has happened on the upper diagonal edge. So here's the diagonal edge, and again, it's flipped in here, do you see? So we're just going to continue it down. So first, let's finish the top. So we want to basically press it, make sure the corners are out. And the big thing here is to make sure that the seam line where it was sewn is right on the edge of the two pieces. If it rolls, it's better for it to roll to the inside of the garment. And where you've done the understitching, it actually will naturally do that. But where you don't have understitching, it kind of won't. Okay, so I'm going to just press here first. Okay, and then as I mentioned, where you have understitched it, the edge seam has rolled ever so slightly to the inside, which is good. That's something we want. I'm just going to trim a thread here. So allow it to do that. Then I'm going to continue all the way over to here. And it's a curve, so you want it to be a curve, sort of a flat curve as it were, because of how it goes around your body. So you want it to be there. Okay. All right, now let's go to the diagonal edge. So this is what I showed you. It started folding over here. So you want to continue folding over the edge by 1/2 inch all the way down. So I'm just going to eyeball it because I do this kind of thing a lot. But you can measure it with a ruler to make sure you are doing it at the right amount. Okay, and I'm just going to finish and leave that end bit there for a second. So now I'm going to go to the front overlayer edge. Do this. Again, just trimming threads that I didn't do before. Okay, and now we're going to do the bottom. So I'm going to fold this up like so. So this is now 1.5 inches. So again, I'm going to eyeball it, but you can measure it, and then we just keep on going all the way over. And then when you get to this end, they just fold on top of each other. So basically, it's just a little folded corner. This part is actually going up, so it's not a totally straight line across the hem. There we go. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to be doing is top stitching the hem. So we want to put some pins in. Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to hem this in one go. So we are going to sew at just under 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down the diagonal side, and then at the 1.5 inch across the bottom. And it's easier to see on the back. So we're basically sewing just on the edge of this, and then we're going to turn, and then we're going to go just along the edge of this. So I'm going to show you how to top stitch it, and then this is the angle, just so you see. So it's not a right angle here at the underlay, it is at an angle. So we are going to top stitch it. However, if you would rather get a kind of invisible look, which is actually what we did, I think, on the wool sample, you can hand stitch along here using a blind stitch, which I have another video for, so you can watch it. But right now I'm going to show you how to do top stitching, which is a little bit easier. So we go along here. So I'm just keeping it in place for when we top stitch. So that's the side. And here is the bottom. Now, top stitching from the right side is a little bit tricky when you're a beginner, if you are not yet used to like sewing really accurately. So you have a couple of options here. Option one is to mark in chalk the hemline so that you can just follow up. And there is nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that your chalk or your marker is easily washed off. You don't want to have it permanently on. But you can like just draw the line there and then follow it. Another option is you can sew from the wrong side. Now you might think, well, that's just the obvious thing to do. Why wouldn't I always sew from the wrong side? It's easier to see. Well, the reason is that a sewing machine has a top needle and a bottom needle or bobbin, and they come together. And the stitch quality is higher on the top needle than it is on the bobbin thread. So it just looks a bit better. Is it marginal? I mean, sometimes it's a bit marginal. As a beginner, you might think, well, it doesn't really matter. But broadly speaking, you usually want your top needle threads to be on the outside. However, if you're just learning, feel free to flip it over and top stitch from the wrong side. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and sew this hem. Okay, so I'm starting on the underlayer at the diagonal edge. And here we want to catch the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going just in from 1/2 inch, because if I went at 1/2 inch, I'd potentially fall off the edge quite a lot. So I want it to be just in from 1/2 inch. And I'm going to go all the way down towards the bottom. Okay. And then what I've done, we are going to change over to going just in from 1.5 inches. So I have marked the junction in chalk there because it's not obvious, right? Because you're not continuing at the same seam allowance, you're changing. So I've marked the junction there. Coming up to it, needle down, press a foot up, pivot, and now I'm going to go across. So if you don't have some kind of mark on your machine here, you can put some tape. Now, for me, it looks like the edge of this black here is exactly where I want to be. So that's what I'm using. But if you don't have a mark, you can put some tape there to help. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now I've done the hem, I'm going to do what's called stitching in the ditch. So here is the inside of the skirt right now with the waistband. And what we want to do is stop this flapping up and down. So what I'm going to do is I am going to secure the facing to the skirt in a number of places where it will be invisible. So the first place is at the side seam. So here's the side seam. And if we sew precisely on top of this seam on the outside, it will connect the facing to the skirt without being visible at all. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm making sure those are lined up and I'm putting some pins on the right side. So here's the tie. I've pinned this down and I want to sew until about the bottom of the facing. It doesn't matter if it's a bit less, a bit more, it doesn't really make any difference. And I'm going to do what's called stitch in the ditch, which is sewing directly in the well, in the valley of the seam there. So I'm going to line it up, back stitch, and I'm sewing. You also can use coordinating color thread, which will further help it become invisible. And there we go. So from the outside, once I trim those threads, you won't be able to see that. And on the inside, it has now secured it down. So I'm going to do that at the other side seam here. So let me just quickly do that now. Okay. So I've now done it at both side seams. And now there's an additional place you can do it, which is in the dart. So we have another opportunity here where there's a seam that we can sew inside of. So once again, I'm going to just pin the facing underneath. And I'm going to sew in the valley down a couple of inches. Okay, so we've done that one as well. So the final thing is just to do the final dart. Oh, the thread's messing up a little bit there. There we go. Okay, we are very nearly almost there. So I did the top stitching down the sides, so I am just going to give that a quick press. And across the bottom, you always want to make sure that you successfully caught the hem and that it isn't undone anywhere. Believe me, that happens to me too sometimes. So I'm just going all the way across the bottom. Okay, and now we're at the very last stage and we are going to do buttons and buttonholes. So an interesting topic because it's one that is often very, very intimidating for new sewists, but I'm here to tell you, you can tackle it and it's a worthwhile thing to learn how to do because you're gonna have to do it a lot in your sewing career. So here we have, so here's the tie, here we have the underlayer, the front underlayer. So the buttonhole is going to go here at the edge. So the first thing we need to do is mark it. So to mark it, the end of the buttonhole is intended to be about 1/2 inch down from the top and 1/2 inch in from the side. So to do that, the easiest way is just to chalk a line 1/2 inch in from this side and 1/2 inch in from this side. So we now know that we want the corner to be here, and I'm just trying to see how I can make it as clear as possible. Let's see if this is clearer for you. There we go. Okay, so we want the end of the buttonhole to be here. So now you want to get your button, which as I say, you want something that's about 1 inch, pretty flat. I am going to place it here to see how long the buttonhole needs to be. And basically you want it to be comfortably bigger than the button so that the button can go in, because the button has like depth as well as width. So you need to make sure the buttonhole can go all the way around here. So the general rule of thumb is to add about 1/8 inch to 1/2 inch longer than the button. So I'm going to put it there and I'm just going to mark, say, here, which is about somewhere between an eighth and a quarter of an inch longer. So I'm going to do my final measurement here. And as it happens, my button is ever so slightly wider than an inch. So if anything, I might err on this line being ever so slightly down from half an inch because we don't want the button to be extending over when it's done up. So I now have this marking here, which means this is where I'm going to be doing my buttonhole. So the next step is to go over to the machine. Okay, so when you are sewing a buttonhole, you need to first learn how your machine sews buttonholes. And there are actually a great variety of different ways that a machine can do that. So definitely get out your manual. I'm going to be demonstrating on this Academy from Burnett. And this is actually a fairly typical buttonhole for a more of a like beginner basic machine, but it is possible that yours will be a little bit different. So bear that in mind. So the first thing I'm going to do is set it to the right settings over here. So I need to pick the buttonhole stitch. So here it's very clearly a picture of a buttonhole. So I'm going to turn it to that. And then for the length of the stitch, here it's actually showing you a buttonhole again. So I turn it to buttonhole, but usually it's about half 0.5, so 0.5 millimeters. Then you also need to set the width. So on my machine, I want to go all the way up to a 6 here. So normally I'm at 2.5. You can change it. I'm going to use a 6. One thing we're going to show you in a second is that you want to test on scraps first. So you'll discover later if you don't like that, but we're going to start with a 6. Then you need to get your buttonhole foot. So this is a fairly classic buttonhole foot. It's going to attach to the presser foot on this bar here. The shorter bit with the hole faces towards you because that's where the needle goes through. So that section is almost like a normal presser foot. Then we have the back and we have this telescoping piece here. And for this, you actually put the physical button that you are going to be using in the foot and you close it down so it's firm. And this is basically what helps this machine know the length of the foot, the length of the buttonhole that it needs to make. On some machines, you have another dial or you have a screen and it will show you. But this is the most common way that you will do it. So you take one of your buttons, you put it in there, you close it so that it's fully firm. And now you're going to put it on the machine. So this bar here basically clicks in here. So what you do is you lower the presser foot onto it and you pick it up and it's now connected. So now the buttonhole foot is on, we need to pull down this little lever that's quite common on many sewing machines. So it's just at the back here and we pull it down like that and then you push it away. And that sort of indicates the beginning of doing a buttonhole. And what it actually does is it pulls it back. You'll see it in a minute what happens, but you want to pull it down and push it back. So anytime you do a buttonhole, you want to start by doing it on a scrap because machines can be notoriously finicky when it comes to buttonholes. So you want to first run it through, make sure it's threaded right, make sure the settings are at the right settings. And then if you do mess it up, it's not a big problem. So start with a scrap. So here I've marked the length of my buttonhole and the beginning and the end. Now on my machine, I want to line up the needle with this end. And then what happens is the machine goes up, back, across and down. Now occasionally some machines start at the other end. So again, another reason to test because you want to learn about that because it's going to affect where you put your markings on your fabric. So I want to put the end T here under the needle. So I have done that. And then now on this machine, it is as simple as putting my foot down and it's going to do everything for me. So everything that you see, I'm not touching anything. I just have my foot on the pedal. So once it reaches the end and it's gone across the end of the buttonhole a few times, lift it up, lift up the presser foot and pull it off the machine. And there you go, a pretty good buttonhole, all things considered. So now I'm going to go ahead and put the buttonhole onto my Randolph now that I've confirmed that it works. So I'm going to get my marking. Here it is. And I'm going to start at the end of the marking because as we just saw, it starts there and goes back. So I need to push this lever back again because I finished a buttonhole and I'm starting another one. So I need to push it back. And actually, hold on a second. Just go another way. Yeah. Gonna place it underneath with the T underneath the foot. There we go. And one way to make sure your buttonhole is straight is to look at the fabric at the edge here and make sure that this edge is parallel, that there's an even amount here. And that's back, should all be ready. And there we go, one really nice buttonhole at the inner corner of my skirt. So once the buttonhole's sewn on the machine, there's a few extra steps. So you need to snip the extra threads off on the front and the back. And then we need to open the buttonhole. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. I have two favorite ways. So I'm going to show you those ways, but there are a number of different ways. The really big thing with the buttonhole is you want to cut in the middle of here, but not cut the threads. Because as soon as you cut the threads, that's it. It's over for your buttonhole. It's going to fray, it's not going to work. So we need to only be cutting directly in this gap here. I find the best way to do that is with a scalpel or X-Acto knife because you can get really, really accurately in there. The other thing that I recommend that you can use is a buttonhole chisel. So this is a specific sewing implement. You can buy them in different widths. This one is 1.2 millimeters, which is what, half an inch wide. So it's made for half-inch wide buttonholes, but you can use it for any width. So with the scalpel, this is how I do it. I start by looking at one end and I start at the end and pull back towards the center because that is the most controlled way to do it. And what you really want to avoid doing is skating through the ends, which is very, very easy to do, especially if you use scissors, which is commonly encouraged thing to do, but I don't recommend it. So you start at the end and pull towards the middle. And as you can see, I'm on a cutting mat. You mustn't do this onto anything else. And then turn around, start at the other end, and go in. And it's as simple as that. Now, if your fabric frays a lot, you can actually buy this special glue called Fray Check. And if you use that, what you do is you put the glue all around on the stitching and it just reinforces any little bits and makes it less likely to fray. But honestly, most of the time I don't bother. If there are a few little fraying pieces here, they will come off over time and then they will go. If you want to use the buttonhole chisel, what you would do is you line it up with one end, go up, and then press really hard. So I'm going to do it at an angle so you can see what I'm doing. You would like press really hard, slice through, and then you would go along to the other end, press really hard, and slice through. So that's how you use a buttonhole chisel. Again, you need to use it on a mat. So that's how you do it on the demonstration piece. Let's look at our Randolph. Okay, so here is our Randolph with the buttonhole. So I'm going to start by trimming the threads. And cutting this one open is slightly harder because we're going through 2 layers, whereas on the demonstration one, I was only showing you 1 layer. So even more reason why I recommend an X-Acto knife. So I'm going to start at that end and pull back. And then I'm going to flip, start at that end and work back. And there we go. So it is fraying a little bit there. So if you care about that, this is definitely something where you can use a little bit of fray check, but there is your buttonhole. Well done. You have done it. You have conquered what many people are very scared of. So the final thing is to put the button on. So first of all, we need to determine where our button's going to go. So the way that this dress works, so skirt works, this is the back. The underlayer goes under, and then the overlayer goes over. So the buttonhole is going onto the overlayer facing here. Now, There is a buttonhole marking on the skirt, which is kind of the recommended place for it to go. But this is the nice thing about sewing. It can go wherever you want. So what I recommend doing is trying on your skirt right now, putting it on around you, just hold this in place, put the overlayer over, and then just look at where it suits you for this to be. And there's flexibility. It could be a little bit in, it could be a little bit out. So you get to choose where the button is going to go. So in this case, I am just going to sew it here, roughly where the marking was. So now you're going to need a hand needle and some thread. To sew a button on, you need your fabric, a button, your needle, and some thread. So I'm going to show you on a scrap how to do this. So first of all, take your thread, and on one end, you are going to make a little knot. There are different ways of doing this, but that is a simple one and it works. And then on the other end of the thread, you are going to just thread the needle. So you can sew buttons on a double thickness of thread, in which case what you can do, instead of knotting the end of one, you can knot these two together, or you can just do a single strand of thread, which if you're using buttonhole thread is usually fine. So you now want to place your button on top of the marking that you have made for where you want your buttonhole to go. And you are going to begin by taking your needle on the wrong side of the fabric. You are going to put your needle through. You have to kind of feel for it and pull it out of the first hole, like so. Pull it all the way out. Now, depending on whether your button has 4 holes or 2 holes, is going to depend a little bit what you do next. Usually, you then go to the diagonally opposite hole and go through the back. And then continue to go backwards and forwards a few times. Now, as you're doing this, you don't want to pull really, really tight. You actually want a little bit of looseness at the back of the button. So I'm going to go through another time. Up and then down. And then now, because this is a button that has 4 holes, I'm going to do the opposite ones. So again, you have to like feel your way, come up through the opposite, down, and just do that a couple of times. Not pulling it too tight as you go down. Now we're almost there. So now we're going to come up one more time. And then when you go through the other side, you're not going to go through all the way the fabric. You're just going to go through to the other side of the button. Okay? Now we're going to create a shank. So basically, we're going to wrap the threads between the button and the fabric. And doing this reinforces them, but it also makes the button go on more nicely through the buttonhole, because it is creating just this little bit of lift. So I've gone around 2 or 3 times. Once you've done that, then put your needle back through the fabric, over onto the wrong side, and pull it through. And then now you simply want to secure it. So you can just take another stitch, loop the needle through the loop, and just do that 1 or 2 times. And there you go. You have a nice secure button. It's got a little bit of a shank. It's going to hold on nicely. So with that theory, let's attach this button to the Randolph. So I have the Randolph here. I have my marking, which is on the facing of the overlayer. And this is something that's nice about the facing. We are just going to attach the button to the facing and not the outside, which means that there'll be nothing visible on the outside. So it's another benefit of facings. So I have my fingers under the facing. I'm going to place the button on the marking, And then I'm going to come up behind the facing, but not going through the outer side. And I have a knot on the end of this button. So out, in on the opposite diagonal corner. Just going to go backwards and forwards doing that a few times. Then I'm going to do the opposites. Okay, and then I'm going to come up one more time, go through the button, but not through the fabric. So I'm going to come out on this other side here, come out. I'm going to wind this, oops, I'm going to wind this behind the button a couple of times to make a shank. There we go. And then I'm going to go back down the wrong side into the wrong side of the facing. Out here, take one stitch, then put my needle through the loop, and that's a knot. And I'm just going to do one more to make it nice and sturdy. And there we go, there's the button. So the final thing I'm going to do is just check that it fits through the buttonhole. So I'm going to bring it round as if it's being worn, which is like this. And I just have to check that it fits through the buttonhole. Moment of truth? Yes. So there we go. We've got a button and a buttonhole. And the really nice thing is, this is on the inside of your skirt. So if you don't do it perfectly, it doesn't matter. No one will see it. The only cool thing is that it actually works. And there it is. It does. So well done. You have made your wrap skirt, the Randolph skirt, and I hope you enjoy wearing it. So where to go from here? Well, with the skills you have learned, you are ready to tackle all sorts of woven patterns. So I would recommend checking out the Montrose top and the Springfield top. The Montrose is almost like a woven t-shirt. So it has short sleeves, it's got different options for the back, and it's such a versatile garment. You can really, any kind of woven fabric that you have, if you have something that's like special and you love it, it's a great option. And the Springfield is a sleeveless tank pattern. So again, it's like simple, there's different options for how you can finish it and how you can use the back, but you have skills to be able to do that now. If you fancy tackling pants, you can also do that. I know it seems scary, but I know you can do it. I would recommend starting with the Calder pants, which are wide-legged pants. They have a flat front and an elasticated back waist. And they're one of our most popular patterns because they look cool and they're really easy to wear. So you can check out all those patterns at cashmerette.com. Second, learning to fit. Once you have the basics of how to sew, learning to fit is really what will elevate your sewing and get you to the point where you're making garments that just fit you beautifully. I recommend checking out my book, Ahead of the Curve. So Ahead of the Curve is just the ultimate guide for fitting if you are curvy. There are lots and lots of in-depth tutorials with tons of full color photos which show you before and after. So it helps you identify what's the issue and how do you fix it and what would it look like once it was fixed. It also has 5 beginner-friendly patterns in it, which makes it really good value. So if you want to check out Ahead of the Curve, go to cashmerette.com/AOTC. You can also join our club. So if you are newly bitten by the sewing bug and you think, this is fantastic, I want to connect with more people, well, we have over 4,500 people who are in our Cashmerette Club and are so excited to talk all things sewing with you. So the Cashmerette Club is a monthly members-only subscription program where you get a new pattern every month and you get a masterclass from me where I talk for like upwards of an hour about fitting issues and really explain them in depth in a way that you might not have heard before. We have live events, there are discounts, there's all kinds of things. So it's really, really fun. If you are getting into sewing, I can't recommend it enough. We have ways to join on a monthly basis. We have ways to join on a yearly basis. Go to cashmerette.com/club to learn more. And finally, I encourage you to sign up for our beginners newsletter. So go to cashmerette.com/learn to sew newsletter, and you will receive exclusive offers for our beginners, tips and tricks, and lots of different things to help you stay in touch with what's going on at Cashmerette and learn how to sew amazing garments. I look forward to seeing you over there.